Hello and welcome to the Curiosity and Consciousness podcast with me, Karen Maloney. I am your host, and the intention of this podcast is to help us open our minds, get curious about ourselves, and to raise our vibration and consciousness levels. Through these conversations, we hope that you will go on an inward journey to discover the truth of who you are and to become aware of your own energy and vibration. We have the power to consciously create our lives, but we need to wake up to this fact before we can begin the process and learn the key of self-responsibility. Check out the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Acast, Castbox, or whatever platform you listen on, and please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Leave a review, leave a rating, as this will help it to reach more people. Check out my website as well, Soul Power Light, www.soulpowerlight.com. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome. Thanks for joining and tuning in for another episode. Hopefully you will get lots of wisdom and nuggets again from today's conversation. I have a fantastic guest joining me again this week, talking about a really interesting topic and conversation. So her name is Chelle, and Chelle is a Metaphysical Minister, Family Constellation Facilitator, and clinical hypnotherapist. She guides women as they connect the dots from the mother wound to issues in their relationships, career, finances, fertility, health, and parenting. She does this with her paradigm-shifting, evidence-based, trauma-informed healing experience that breaks generational and subconscious cycles of pain between daughters and their mothers. This is a really interesting conversation around a really interesting topic and Chelle's work around mother wounds. And she shares a little bit about her own mother-daughter relationship and even her own relationship with her own children and the impact that unresolved wounds and traumas can have on future generations. And she talks about mother wounds. Really, that work is looking at that unresolved trauma and the generational impact of the pain and hurt between women in a family system. She boldly exclaims that 8 out of 10 women have a mother-daughter wound, and that's as a result of mothers who haven't done their own healing work themselves before becoming a mother. That unresolved wound is passed on. So, super interesting conversation, and she talks about how this wound can show up for different people, whether becoming a people pleaser, infertility issues and health issues, feeling like an imposter, codependency, or that fixer aspect of the personality. She also shares tools that have really helped her, and now that she has trained in to help clients to look at this unresolved trauma and to bring healing to the person, to the mother-daughter relationship, and to the family system. And some of her work includes family mapping, family constellations, hypnosis, and body work. And it's really important work that looks at an internal shift, and it's really about handing back the piece of the trauma or the core issue or the core complaint that is not ours to deal with, handing that back so then we can move through our own piece. So really interesting. She also touches on our inner child or the little girl within us and how she may be screaming for help or love or affection, and getting curious about how that may show up for us in our external relationships as well, and really learning to reparent and become the mother to that aspect of ourselves as well, in order to come back to wholeness and not living in this cycle of just repeated patterns and passed on generational trauma. And again, like always, a lot of these patterns are often very subconscious. We don't even know we're carrying them until we do the inner work and get curious. So lots of information here, really interesting conversation about a topic that I certainly haven't heard about too much. The work, yes, different aspects of the work, but that actual mother-daughter wound, it was super interesting to learn more. And if you want to find out more on Rev Chelle's work, you can go to her website, revchelle, or evchelle.com. Check out her website, share the episode with anyone who you think may benefit. And as always, I will have a link to all Rev Chelle's work on the show notes as well on my website, soulpowerlight.com, and click the podcast section. Enjoy. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining me for another episode. I'm super excited to bring today's guest, who is Rev Celle. So first of all, you're very welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on. I'm very excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. You do, well, you're a metaphysical minister and do family constellation work and also a clinical hypnotherapist. So you've lots of tools and skills under your belt. But maybe describe a little bit about your background or what led you to your work.
Gosh, it's interesting that as most people who work in holistic healing or in the healing industry, oftentimes we just have our own connection to the journey that takes us here. And for me, because my work is mother wound work, I really came to this work by trying to work out my own mother wound. If I look back probably to about 2014, 2015, I had got an invitation to participate in a anthology called The Strength of My Soul. Mm-hmm. And in that, I wrote a story about how, even though I tried to reject and be completely different than my mother and some of the challenges that my mother and I had as I was growing up, what I found is that the more that I rejected her, the more that I was just like her. Mm-hmm. And so this story that I wrote was called Mitochondrial Semantics. It's complicated and really about the complications in our relationship and how I really just started. That was the start of healing my mother wound, right? Really just looking at that and what it meant in my life. And then, fast forward a few years later, I went to school to be a hypnotist. I knew that when I opened my business, I wanted to work with women and trauma. And by chance, I had my own podcast at the time, and I had interviewed a woman by the name of Joanna Lynn of the Family Imprint Institute. And she was, or still is, a family constellation practitioner. And before the call was even done, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Yeah. There was this piece that I was looking for that I wanted to add to my practice that could, just help women along this healing journey. And it was in that training, kind of maybe 6 months into it, that I really started to hone in on how I could use the skills of constellation work, of family mapping, of hypnosis to really help women dig in and resolve the parts of them that was their mother wound. Mm-hmm. And so I, started focusing on that, and here I am. And I absolutely love what I do.
Oh, amazing. And I love, well, maybe even just explain a little bit first for anyone who may not be familiar. I know it kind of seems self-explanatory, but also what exactly is a mother wound? And then actually, how prevalent are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some people can define a mother wound differently. I've seen lots of different definitions that really at the core of it, for me, as it pertains to the work that I do, a mother wound is a wound that you carry as a result of being under-mothered or over-mothered. Mm. So under-mothered would be, the neglectful mother, the absent mother, the abandoned mother, any ways that you were not nurtured and loved as you should have been as a child. And then the over-mothering, this is the one that tends to be a little bit more hidden because, over-mothering can really exist on a spectrum. It's, that completely, controlling mother who never lets you have a thought of your own to mm-hmm. the one that doesn't let you fly. She loves you. She wants you to do your best, but she just won't let you fly. And so, it gets to, it creates this wound in you that becomes unsure of yourself and unable to stand on your own 2 feet and unable to carry your own fate. So that's mm-hmm. a kind of what a over-mothering is. How prevalent is it? I'm going to be really bold. Yeah. I'd say out of 10 women, 8 of them probably carry some form of a mother wound. And I don't say that to pathologize, everything that we go through. I say it to, I think that the relationship between mother and daughter, just in and of itself, is complicated. It's just a very dynamic, very layered relationship, and I find it hard to believe that we're going to escape, the teenage years or
Yeah.
even childhood without some semblance of a mother wound, just because unless your mother has done all of her, healing work before she becomes a mother, chances are she's going to come to mothering with some wound of her own. And that's what the mother wound work really does, is it takes a look at the generational impact of unresolved trauma and unresolved pain and hurt between the women in your family. And so I'm going to be really bold and probably say 8 out of 10 people who I work with or who I talk to, have some sort of a mother wound.
Yeah. And is it, you mentioned the mother-daughter, is it specific to that, or is it also mother-son?
So the work that I do is specifically mother and daughter, right? Just because, but mother wounds for sons do show up, and they do exist. They just show up a little bit differently.
Yeah.
What I would call a mother wound between mother and daughter would be a father wound between father and son.
Okay,
it's that core gendered relationship that really does have some impact on the way that we just orient to and really relate to the world. I get that question all the time, and there are people. There are men out there who are deeply wounded by their mothers, and that's definitely work that needs to be done. I just don't focus on that. I have some other people that I would refer out.
Yeah. That just makes total sense. But it was just something that popped into my head, and it would make sense that, yes, it could be, a son issue as well. Yeah. But I love what you say, or maybe you could talk a little bit about the generational impact, because in one sense, without knowing much about mother-daughter wounds and different things like that, I do truly believe that every person, no matter whether they've been through some huge trauma or not, everyone carries something that's been passed on generationally, ancestrally. And, I've done family constellation work as well. And it's just so fascinating, the information that you glean and you see that you're like, wow. So maybe just even talking a little bit about actually the impact or the imprints that are passed on or can be passed on.
Yeah. There's a whole field out there called epigenetics, and there has been a lot of talk and a lot of work probably in the last 50 years, even less than that. I would say really in the last 20 years about epigenetics and what that means. And really it's the cellular effect that we inherit from our parents, and they inherit from their parents. And it's not just trauma, right? It's anything that our ancestors or our parents or even their parents have experienced, because everything that we experience gets lodged and gets experienced by the body, right? So if and I'm just going to talk about trauma here from one, just to kind of narrow it down to one perspective. Yeah. If we have, there's two people that I can name that have done some really great work on this. Number one is Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she talks about the epigenetic effect of chattel slavery on the Black community, right? So it's a really interesting read if you're ever interested in looking at, epigenetics from the American Black perspective and how it has, just affected through the generations. Yeah. Rachel Yehuda is another one that has done a lot of epigenetic writing on the effects of the Holocaust on the Jewish community. And there's another book out there called My Grandmother's Hands, by Resma Menachem, and he talks about the epigenetic responses of trauma within white communities, Black communities, policing communities. And it's this whole idea that we come into this life with all of the imprints and all of the lessons that were experienced by our parents if they're not resolved. Yeah. And that's really what it is. It's unresolved trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the next. All of those books are highly recommended. Another one that is directly related to the work that I do is called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolin. I'm kind of, I always like to say this, I'm like Mark's grandchild, because my teacher was directly trained by Mark. And so the work that he talks about in It Didn't Start With You is really trickled down to to the work that I do and the methods that I use. But if we look at it, everything that is unresolved in the prior generations gets expressed through the body and through our own mechanisms and coping mechanisms in our life. And so how it pertains to the mother wound is, let me talk about my mom. So my mom had severe trauma in her early life. She had an alcoholic mother. who rejected her, who abandoned her emotionally. And so my mom comes to motherhood then with those abandonment wounds, right? And so she wasn't able to really connect with what it means to be a mother, to connect with what it means to bond with your child, because she didn't have that. And so the results of that was not only her own addiction because of the pain she experienced by her mom, but having, her 5 children removed out of the home at one point or another. I got married when I was very young. My other siblings were all adopted. And taken from her and adopted. And so that's just one example of what it means to, how does that, go from, mother to mother. And then for me, and I talk about this in the book that I wrote, or the chapter that I wrote in the book, it also led me, growing up in foster homes, not really having that ability to understand nurturing, to understand bonding, which led to my own issues with my own children, and in our divorce and the separation, and my children went and lived with their father, and the pain that caused. So it's these generations of abandonment and, addiction and, recovery and those kinds of things. It just transferred from one generation to another.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe just just to help people as well to connect a bit more who maybe didn't have huge trauma or addiction issues or that, what are some of the other subtle ways that it can show up? I know you mentioned, the unmothered or the overmothered, but are there other kind of subtle ways that it can show up in that mother-daughter relationship, and then, the kind of unconscious impact it can have, on their lives and the lives of others?
It really starts to show up in the way that we relate to others and in other types of relationships in our life. So sometimes it'll subtly show up as, if you had a mother who was emotionally dependent or overly dependent on her daughter to meet her own emotional needs, a daughter grows up thinking that it's her responsibility to meet everybody's needs. And so maybe she might experience a lot of codependency in her relationships. Right. So that's one way. So she becomes a people pleaser, and it's really difficult for her to set boundaries. And what she finds is, she gets to this point in life where she's just overwhelmed with her inability to say no, and her inability to, kind of take a stand with her needs and make sure that her needs are met. I think one of the ones that we overlook a lot is, if we grew up in a home that wasn't nurturing or it wasn't encouraging, it may show up in our career as imposter syndrome. If we never had a parent that said, you can do this, and encourage you to, stretch yourself and celebrate you for your accomplishments, you might go into the workforce thinking that you don't belong to be there, or that at any moment somebody's going to think you're a fraud because surely you're not capable of all these accomplishments that you had. Fertility, it can show up in fertility of, if, there's a saying that says, if you don't trust your mother, you don't trust yourself. And, if there was a relationship between you and your mother and you didn't trust her in the way that she parented you, even in small ways, you may, as you start to have children, if you experience like non-specific fertility, it could be that your body is saying, I don't trust myself to be the parent that I know this baby needs to be. And so it might, affect your fertility. There's all kinds of ways that it can affect your life, even in very subconscious ways that you may not even connect.
Yeah. That's the thing. Sometimes it is so unconscious and unknown, and that's why, the importance of doing the inner work and the healing work. And honestly, for me, I think everyone's on a healing journey. Yeah. Once you're born, like we all have healing to do like that. And there doesn't have to have been massive trauma or anything like that. But as you say, those imprints, things are passed down unknowingly. And it's only when you do like exploring like that it's like, oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So then just talk a little bit about your work and what kind of tools or practices do you use then to help a person, to move through some of them?
Yeah. So I use 3 specific main tools, right? So it's family mapping, family constellations, and clinical hypnosis. So family mapping is In a nutshell, it is a very specific genogram, which takes a 3-generational history of your family using the core language approach. And the core language approach is really using the words that you use to describe your family, the words that stick out, the words that seem to have like super importance and huge resonance with the story that lies within your family. And so, we start out, I'll start out with questions, like, what brought you to want to work with me? What is it that's happening in your life right now? What is your biggest fear? What is, if you were not to be able to resolve that issue, what would be the biggest fear in that? And we start to narrow down to your core trauma or to your core complaint. And in that, we then take it to the genogram or to the family map and see where else that same issue has shown up in your family, in the hopes that we can find the core trauma or the root of the issue that you're bringing into constellation. And then once we figure that out, we move into constellation work that takes that story that you've been carrying internally through epigenetics, through the stories in your family, through the ways that this has shown up in your life. We take that internal story and we move it into an outer experience. And what that can look like sometimes is a lot for if we're just doing mother wound stuff. Let's just say you have a mother who had a really deep emotional need and depended on you to meet those. We would move into constellation to have a conversation between you and mom, where we would have you representing you and an object representing mom, and you get to have that conversation that you've probably never been able to have with her. And in that, really handing back the faith that she's giving you that doesn't belong to you, handing back the need that she had, and really saying, the way that I respect you now is to let you carry this on your own. And in that, I'm going to go my way, and I'm going to learn to love myself and do the things that you couldn't give to me. And so it's this shift, this internal shift that allows you to take that story and create a new one that lives more in resolution and standing in your own power and in your own rightful place as daughter and not caretaker to your mom. And then hypnosis, I really use along the way because there's a lot of visualization, a lot of meditation, and sometimes just downright clear hypnosis to start to unwork those subconscious connections that you have to the story that you've been carrying. And so all 3 of those tools really work. And in there, I will, sprinkle a lot of body-based, especially in constellation. As we work through something, I'm constantly checking in with the body. Where do you feel that in your body? What is your body telling you? What is it telling you and how to resolve this? What is it that your body needs right now? How do you need to feel grounded? And so we're constantly doing body check-ins as well. This is really largely a body-based process once we get into constellation work, because if we understand that trauma, whether it is our own, whether it is a generational trauma, lives in the body, then the goal is to move it out of the body into resolution.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. And like that. Yeah. So powerful as well, because, and the fact that you bring in the body element as well, because that's where everything lives, that is the cellular level of the epigenetics as well in our subconscious mind. And that's really the level, to work at, as opposed to the thinking mind, because we can think all the hell we want, but it's not necessarily going to think us out of or think our way into healing. Like, it's a really powerful tool, obviously our mind, but I think like that we have to get underneath and resolve the inner issues first of all, and then use the thinking mind as, like you say, that powerful tool then in creating this new story and this new narrative to help you moving forward.
Completely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, I'm just curious as well, from your own experience and your own healing and that, and especially having gone through so much pain and sorrow, from having done all this work now as well, when you look back on because I know for me, from having done constellation work and just seeing others as well, like I got this huge sense of compassion, and people are always trying to do their best, no matter really how that kind of appears, because again, we're carrying these kind of things we don't know. So I'm curious to know how you look on your whole kind of experience so far.
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, yeah. When I think about my mother, and I think I've always been inclined to feel this way because I knew that my mom had a really, really hard time as a kid. And I went back and forth. There were times in my life where I was like, I can't stand my mom and she's the worst ever. And my mom just didn't have what it took. Like I knew that really early, but there were times in the healing journey that I was so angry at her, right? Because I just feel like she should have given me more than what she should have given me, or she just should have let me stay in foster care, or she should have let me be adopted, or, you know, there's all these scenarios that we can hold about our mom. And at the end of the day, really what that is it's the wounded little girl in us just trying to get their needs met. And so I've always had the ability to be in therapy or counseling because I was a foster kid, right? So when you're a foster kid, at least back then, I don't know how it is now, but back then I had to stay in constant counseling. And so I've always had this very, you know, tools-oriented approach to managing my emotions. But it wasn't really until I started to come into the healing work that I do that I really dug as deep as I needed to dig. And it was so interesting because at the time that I was going through this course, my family was going through this really huge transition with my own children. And it brought me face to face with the way, like everything that I wrote about in that chapter, in that anthology, and it just came face to face, and I had to like heal it in real time, in real life. And I was so glad that I was going through the training at the time, because it put me in this whole other place where not just about my mom, but also about my dad, right? So I got to do some healing work around my dad. And that just shifted the way that I was able to show up for my kids. And it also showed me smack dab how I was harming my children, right? In doing the things that I thought were the absolute best for them, I was incredibly harmful. Taking away choice of theirs, being controlling, having to rescue them, being completely codependent in our relationship. And it really wasn't until I started to do this work that I was able to really see that. And so there was just a huge shift in the ways that I related to myself first, related to my children, related to my spouse, related to my friends, just because I really saw, because my battle was codependency. Like I was the responsible child that took care of everybody. And so I got to see how damaging that was, and how, you know, we both play victim and perpetrator in our lives. And I think that idea and that understanding on the level that I was able to get because of my own trials I was experiencing at the time really just opened my heart to have this deep compassion for everybody that came before me, which really is what this work does. It really does shift the story you carry internally and open it to compassion.
Super powerful. Yeah, because, you know, well, yeah.
I feel like I kind of rambled there, but did I answer the question?
Yeah, like so important, you know, that to get to that level, and like, you know, like you mentioned, those, you know, going through those emotions and periods of, oh, I can't stand her and why this and why that, like they're all normal as well. But to continue, you know, to see the patterns and to do the work and to get to that level of compassion for everyone then, you know, is just super. Like it's such an important thing I think we all need a little bit more of, you know, even currently as well. But just something as well, you know, that you mentioned that I think actually comes up a lot, and especially with the shifting and the changing times that we're going through. And maybe I think it might be something really useful for people. And it comes back to the over-mothering that you mentioned. And you just mentioned there again, kind of taking away that choice, even, you know, from your own kids at times. And how now, if there's any parents listening who are really, and you know, it's coming from, you know, the good intention of trying to obviously protect their kids and mind them, you know, but then there's also that covering them in cotton, you know, we can't do that, and getting to a place of allowing them to make their own decisions, knowing that failure and there will be sadness and loss and, you know, that's all part of life. But how can people get I suppose, more settled into allowing their children to make their choices and, you know, not take that from them?
I think the first thing, the starting place, is doing your own work.
But if they don't want to?
Yeah, if they don't want to, then what is unresolved in the parent goes unresolved in the child.
Or maybe even what then could help, maybe if there's a listener going through that at the moment. So they have no influence in the mother. They know the mother needs help, but she doesn't want to. How could they maybe then take, you know, say even if they're at home again at the moment, you know, with all that's going on, they had to move back. How could they take their own autonomy without completely destroying the relationship? You know, is there anything maybe that can help that person?
So, you know, I always say that this work is independent of what your mother does or doesn't do. It absolutely does not depend on how your mother shows up to her own healing work, unfortunately. You know, so because healing work, as we become adults, right, we have to take ownership of our own path and our own healing and the wounds that lay within us. And we have to, at some point, decide that this really is ours to fix and ours to heal, and ours to resolve. You know, I do have clients who still, you know, have lived with mom, and it's really difficult because they're, you know, completely entrenched in that relationship. And so what we start with is building a base for boundaries and building a starting place that even says, this is my area and I'm going to fix this and you have to stay over there, even if it's just an internal boundary that we set. And it helps them feel a little bit more powerful and a little bit more autonomous as they start down this healing work. And then there really just has to be a decision on the person who's doing the healing work to face the things that they need to face and to do the work that they need to do to resolve the ways that whatever their mom is doing lands and affects them. And so it is possible. It's not easy, especially if you're still in the home with mom. And I say, I'm assuming that these are adults in the home with mom, not children or not teenagers. I'm talking, you know, grown adults. Every situation is different, but it is possible to build that internal boundary and that internal space where you can start to do the healing work, so that when mom does that thing that sinks you into the behaviors and the patterns that you have with each other, you feel a little bit more stronger in standing in your own place and learning how to remother yourself. You know, that looks a little bit different for everybody, but I always start with building this internal boundary system that you can lean upon. And then depending upon where the issues lie, we go from there. And sometimes it's a matter of really understanding the system of your family and why it is the way that it is. For me, the mapping was really, really helpful because for the first time, I got like this bird's eye view of all the issues that I had been battling myself and thinking that I was doing it all alone. But when I saw the ways that it really laid in the family system, I just had a different perspective. And so the things that, you know, that I would have experienced before that would normally just sink me into those codependent tendencies or the depression or whatever it was that I was dealing with, they just didn't land on me the same. And so, you know, it's those kinds of things that we can do.
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing that, because again, it is very individual, but even just giving some markers of, and you know, boundaries again, super important to have healthy boundaries. And like you say, take that little bit of ownership for, you know, our own little piece and what we can do in amidst all the fear or the challenges or the pressure or whatever it is. So thank you for that.
And if I could really just really quick, sometimes it means really looking at the part you play in that story too. Right? Because as adults, you know, we still, even within the relationships that we have with our mother, there is still a part of us that plays a part in that story as a whole. And so what is it that we're doing that contributes to keeping this cycle going, and how do we stop those things? And so a really good look at that can be very helpful as well.
Yeah, so true, because as I say as well before, it's like if something is showing up for us, like it's because we're playing a part. We're a player, no matter whether we think we are or we aren't. Like you say, there is that two-way piece to see. So looking at how we are supporting or fighting or battling or whatever is really important as well. And
sometimes it's subconscious. Sometimes we don't know how it is. And sometimes we just need to put those patterns together. And it's in the realization of those patterns that we go, oh, okay, this makes so much more sense to me now.
Well, I think that is the key. I think most of the time it is subconscious until we start looking, we're like, oh.
Yeah.
This is my role. This is how I keep feeding the fire each time either or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
But just something else as well that I'd like to touch on that you mentioned as well, just that little girl within you and just the importance of, our inner child. We all have one. And to kind of recognize her again, or him or her, and to kind of reintegrate and have her as part of us in order to be whole. Just speaking on the importance of the inner child.
I try to bring her into this process really early and help my client to see how she's existing within them, right? So is your inner child screaming? Is your inner child quiet and non-existent, or like really kind of sitting in a corner somewhere? Like, how is your inner child showing up? And really bringing her into the healing process. And that happens through a lot of visualization. I definitely do some hypnosis around inner child healing. What does it, mean to journey with your inner child back to some of the places that maybe weren't so pleasant? When the circumstances require it, I do a lot of that work. And really at the end of, the sessions that we have, we've done the mapping, we've done the constellation, we get to a place where we feel like we've addressed the big issues. And then how do we bring the inner child, how do we integrate with them? How do we assure the little girl in you that you are going to be the mom now? And you're going to be the mom to her, and you're going to meet her needs, and you're going to make sure that she's taken care of and feels safe and secure. And then as the adult, how do you, working with my client to recognize when that little girl shows up and when she needs to be nurtured? What actions, what behaviors do you exhibit that really are your little girl talking? And when she comes up, how do you take care of her? And so we, when it's necessary, I do a lot of that work with my clients as well, because it's so important. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is that, and I think I said this, your mother wound really is based in the little girl in you trying to get her needs met. And you could be 5 or you could be 65 and still have that little girl screaming out loud that her needs are not getting met. So mother wound healing is all about that.
So true. Yeah. Like just as you say, listen to that little girl, get to know her. How does she show up? What is she screaming for? And like you mentioned there as well, how can you reparent her? How can you be the mother to her now as your adult self? So important as well. And I'd love to know what practices, because again, it's very individual, but what practices do you continue to use that really help you and continue to help you on your healing journey? Like, do you have any daily practices or what supports you?
I think for me, I'm really aware, because codependency really was the way that my mother wound showed up. I'm really aware of when I'm getting out of balance or when, something is not healthy in a relationship. And so a thing that I do and a rule that I made, or a covenant, right? This, I'm going to not say rule, but a covenant that I made with myself is that I will not help anybody unless they explicitly ask me for help.
Yeah.
And for me, that's super important because, I have a tendency to rescue and to save. And even somebody who's doing healing work, there's a real fine line there and making sure that I keep those boundaries. And so, as a practitioner, I do have, I do lead the session often just because it's, that's my job. But I'm really clear with boundaries with my clients. And in my personal life, I just don't rescue anymore. Like, you have to explicitly ask me. Even my own children, they could be hinting around something, and but I've told them, if you need something, you have to ask me for it, because I'm not going to assume it and I'm not going to volunteer it anymore. And that's how I keep myself safe and in my place of integrity.
Yeah, that's great. Really, at the end of the day, I think more of us could take a little bit of that as well, because again, and it helps everyone, because I think that the clearer we can be, and as a person who used to be terrified to ask for help, and kind of giving those clues and trying to, make it so obvious that wasn't obvious, to be like, no, this is clearly what I'm asking for. And people are not mind readers. Nobody needs to be assuming. And again, that's taking ownership for ourselves and our own needs, and having the ability to voice them. So I really like that as well. Well, super interesting conversation and loads of nuggets and information, and just that higher perspective again for people to kind of get curious. again, it's all about getting curious and exploring and, being, I wonder why does this pattern keep showing up, or X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is, and knowing that there absolutely are solutions. There are always ways. But again, it takes us, like you just said, it takes us stepping into our power, taking ownership of our little piece to look for the solutions or resolves to best support ourselves. So lots of information, and please share where people can find more on your work if they wish. And if there's anything, I don't know, that you feel called to share as a parting message, please feel free.
Yeah. So, so you can find me at my website, which is RevChelle, RevChelle.com. I'm on Instagram as the same, at RevChelle. So I wrote a workbook called Mapping Your Mother Wound, and it really is the exploratory process of understanding and finding out where the mother wound lives within your life. And so that book I sell on my website, and on the fourth Wednesday of every month, I host a free online support session for people who are working through that workbook. And then starting in January, I'm going to be hosting online constellation sessions to start to help women resolve the mother wounds that they were able to discover in the workbook. And so if you're interested in doing this work and maybe aren't really sure about, one-on-one sessions, but are interested in exploring what your mother wound looks like, the workbook is a really, really great place to start. And then it comes with free online support each month. So pick that up if you're interested. I would love to support you through this process.
Yeah, wow.
For those of you who are listening.
Yeah, fantastic. Sounds brilliant. And like always, I will have direct links on the show notes as well, so people can go there, and I'll have information to all your website and your work and your social media platforms and all that. So thank you so much for joining today and for sharing about your work and all the tools and the importance of it. And I just wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm so excited to have been on your show, and I just really appreciate you allowing me to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get notified every time a new show is released. Get more information on this week's guest as well on my website, www.soulpowerlight.com.